For the first time, and those that came through the availability of this work for the public as part of our ongoing approach to open government. So for me, this is a really interesting part of the programme. Sorry, I should introduce myself first of all. Yeah, I'm Roger Halliday. I'm the Chief Statistician and Data Officer at Scottish Government, and I'm the Senior Responsible Officer for this programme. And I suppose for getting the value of our data in Scotland more broadly, and for the maintenance of our reputation for safe handling of data. And so we've come to a really interesting point on the programme, in that we've done a discovery phase, we've done quite a lot of research about the technical and the user engagement, and we'll hear a bit about that in a minute. But we're thinking about how we move on to that, to actually try out different approaches to online identity assurance. And so the aim of the session for me today is really to sort of bring you up to speed with where we are, and then also to have conversations about, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for how we take things forward? Because I think we're trying to balance up the desires from public bodies that are quite keen to move forward with this quickly, with just making sure that we're doing the right thing for Scotland, something that's going to work and be applicable quite broadly. And so that's why I'm looking forward to the conversation today. A couple of domestics, first of all, before we start that. If there is a fire today, I don't think there's any fire alarm that's planned, but the main way out is through the door you came in, downstairs, and then if we're told no, you cannot go that way, it's straight on through the offices and off to the right, and there's toilets through the offices straight in front of you as well. We've got a break in the middle that we'll be using as a coffee break. So I didn't want to take up more time at the beginning by questions today. I just wanted to get straight into this. And actually, probably the way into this is kind of reflecting upon the conversation that we had last time, both in terms of the minutes, and we talked last time about the terms of reference for the group. And I think Jess is going to just make sure that everybody's comfortable now with our way of working.
Okay, if I come to the front here, I might be heard a bit better from you. Do the mic? Yes. No, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Good. So yeah, I'm just going to take a few minutes to go over the minutes from the last group meeting, which was on the 8th of February. Hopefully you've all had a chance to review the minutes that were circulated. If not, there are copies of those and other papers from today on your desks. So the first half of the minutes capture the updates that were given at the first meeting. They were on the programme and stakeholder engagement plans, our proposals to work in the spirit of open government, our intention to set up an expert group. Gavin's going to talk a bit about how that's gone later on. And also we heard from We Are Snook about what the service design discovery would involve. So for those of you that were at the first meeting, we had a workshop. And during that workshop we asked you 4 questions. Those were: how do we work together? How do you want to influence the programme? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Quite fundamental, I think. And what are your hopes and fears for the programme? So the workshop for us, I think, produced some really valuable feedback. We're having another one today, so you can look forward to that. So there were 2 very distinct questions asked, sets of questions. Half of them were on the remit and how we're going to work together, and the second were to do with the programme and ways of working and what we might want to think about in developing a new system. So on the first section, we got quite a lot of suggestions about how we can work together, things like frequency of meetings, how we can communicate in an open and helpful way with you guys. So one of the asks in particular that we got was that we should think about the group's membership to make sure that we had the right level of interest and people here who had the right level of influence in developing our work. We have made a couple of changes to the membership on the basis of that. Talk about that in a minute when I get to the remit. Another theme that we spoke about at the workshop was openness and how we can involve you and other stakeholders in the work we're doing. Ross is going to speak later on about what we've been doing with open government and how specifically we're keeping you and everybody else involved in the work we're doing. So the second category of feedback that's reflected in the minutes is on the programme stuff, and that is set out in that as a sort of set of guiding principles, gives us a checklist of considerations, which I think has been really helpful to us during the discovery phase, and is probably going to be very helpful as we go on to Alpha. One of the specific asks that came out of it was the needs of the individual should be at the heart of what we do. I would say we have taken that completely into account with our user research. Susan's going to talk about that. And the other side of that is that we should be mindful of the existing technical landscape, and Mike will talk about how we've taken that into consideration with our technical appraisal. So there were just 3 actions from the meeting. They were to invite representation from Education Scotland. I think we've got Emma Pollock here. The second was to invite somebody from the Children and Young People's Commission of Scotland. They were invited but didn't wish to come along, that's fine. And to invite you all to show and tell on the music design, which we had in March. I think was successful. So that's the minutes. They were published a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. So, any comments? Happy? Okay, so I'll just quickly move on to the remit then. Very few changes to the updated remit. It was just to make some confirmations of the membership. We just added some names in there. And they are on the tables if you want to have a look at them. Otherwise, I would assume everybody's still okay with the remit. And I will pass over to Susan.
The clicker's behind.
Do you want me to use the mic? Vote to the mic? No? Okay. Oh, that's the right slide. So I want to present the outputs from the discovery research. So if you remember, there's 2 areas. The discovery was split into 2 clear, distinct areas of work. One of them was about service design, and the other one was about exploring the technical options. So I'm just going to take you through the findings from the service design work, and then so Mike will take you through the technical stuff. So you have in your papers, I think OIA SG 05, and that contains a summary of the output from the discovery exercise. And Ross, have the full outputs now been published?
They are, we've been told they should be done as we speak.
Okay, any minute now. All of the full outputs from the discovery, and I think it comes to hundreds of pages, or hundreds of pages, well, maybe over 100 pages of outputs. So, if you've got nothing else to do once this meeting's finished up, then there's some great bedtime reading for you there. So we've produced a summary which is included in the papers, which is the more easily digestible outputs, but if you want to go into more detail at any stage, you can. And if you have trouble finding them online, then ask Ross or follow the blog or the Twitter or whatever. So the service design discovery, we commissioned design agency We Are Snook to do our service design research. We have Harriet from Snook here today, so if I haven't got things quite right, I'm sure she might jump in at any stage. That service design research ran from January to April 2018. The remit of that was to carry out user research in the discovery phase to gather insights about user experiences related to digital identity, and to identify the problem that an online identity assurance program might address, explore the user journey, and identify user concerns and needs. That's just a quick visual of the spread of organisations that were involved. At the start of the research, Snook really spoke to a broad selection of organisations, from Scottish Government policy teams, interest in identity agencies, NTPBs, local authority representatives, UK Government Digital Service, and then there's a bunch of voluntary sector organisations involved as well. There was specific research, qualitative research involving interviews with about 30 people in organisations in Falkirk, Glasgow and Dundee, 17 individual interviews spread across a range of ages. And there was a survey also asking for opinions and thoughts about online identity, one dedicated to specifically young people, to hear young people's views, and the other to reach people of all ages. There was the first national stakeholder meeting. Valerie has just said earlier participated in that, and at the show and tell, Snook used that to get a little bit more feedback from stakeholders about the work that they had produced up to that point. So in terms of the findings, some of the clear outputs were 3 recurring themes, principally across all the groups we interviewed in all ages. There were 2 emerging, almost oppositional views. Those who valued convenience around access to the services, so that the service should be they should access them as conveniently and easily as possible. Those who were much more cautious about digital identity, they put a great deal of value on their privacy and security above all other things. And the third theme from that research was about the importance of access, ensuring that services can be accessed without barriers, even if that means through non-digital routes. So in that kind of convenience camp, there were people who expressed exasperation with complex fragmented services, for example, people with disabilities and or carers who had to understand and navigate services from UK government, Scottish government and local authorities to receive the help they needed. People who mentioned having to send multiple originals of documents to different agencies in turn. Reference to It's So Easy with an alternative service, like it seems to work in my bank, why can't it work here, online shopping, etc. So it was about demand to make people's lives easier by simplifying processes and potentially giving permission to the data to be stored and or shared. People were confused with the different interfaces they were presented with in making online applications. They thought was for one service provider, and one thing cited were forms that asked us similar questions in different ways, so that people felt they were being tricked into potentially giving a wrong answer. And again, a little bit more about the convenience. I mentioned people called for reducing the number of forms they had to fill in. Talks about information given, the same information given to multiple departments and agencies perceived as unnecessary, time-consuming and costly. And people who were in this group were keen for data to be shared between organisations to avoid having to provide the same information repeatedly. So on the other side of opinion in this area, on the other side of opinion in this area, there were people who are much, much more cautious about online identity, people who focused on questions like who holds my data, how reliable are they, who can access my data and who controls that, and how safe is my data, and is it safe, is it a risk from hackers? And within that, people had a variety of opinion on who they trust to hold their data. Some people were comfortable with private sector organisations and banks and Google holding data about them, and at the same time distrustful of government. And some people were much more trustful of government, but wary of those private organisations and what they might do. So there's many different complexities within that. There's certainly no typical response. Which the researchers said that this illustrates the need for a range of options that offer choice to suit different people's motivations and concerns. So some expressed over who would have access to any data stored and appropriate and proportionate use of that data. There was citing the importance of having clear information about who can access data, visibility into who can access it, and some called to control their own data. And as mentioned before, there were genuine concerns about the security of data that was held centrally, and the risks and implications of if there was a single online identity service and that was compromised, then that presents a significant risk to somebody and their personal data. So from that, the third theme, accessibility, and accessibility also had the accessibility theme also had different layers to it. For some people, the main barrier to accessing public services in this way was around lack of digital skills, lack of technology or internet access to go online from home. There were specifics, there's specific issues for people who might have visual impairments and who were challenged by online and paper forms that weren't available in formats that they were accessible to them or suitable for text-to-speech translation. There were third sector groups who supported clients with their online applications and forms. So again, what is the role of potential third parties in helping individuals access online services? Mobile accessibility, clearly any solution to online identity assurance must work easily on a mobile phone. So in terms of the outputs, and again, you've got a little bit more in your summary paper, and there's more in the fuller report that we'll be publishing any minute now. So what SNOOC did with this is they constructed, they aimed to construct a simplified user journey for somebody to create and then use their online identity through this common, consistent approach. And so the suggestion was that this approach could be applied across the new service that we might be constructing. So these are 7 easy steps around access to online identity services, from somebody to understand the issue, create an online identity, gather the information they need. They then verify that they are the person who's trying to access the services, and you can confirm, reuse, return, remember in the future. So that's a quick tour around the service design research. There's a lot more detail about user journeys and things like that. If some of you saw the material that was presented at the show and tell, that's being developed into a little bit more. Probably more will need to be taken forward in the next phase. But that's a your introduction to the service design. And if there's any specifics on that, I think we could take comments on all of it together once Mike's finished this. unless there's any kind of specifics in relation to that. Let's take.
I just say that I think it does sound balanced. It sounds realistic. It doesn't sound like a lot of things that you do here, which is everybody's going online or nobody can access online. It does sound as though it's about the right. It feels right. I don't know what other people think, but it just feels as though it's got the right balance and it's achieved what you would hope.
But let's hear a bit more about the how that meets the technical and how that emerges into the programme, and then there should be space in starting to have a bit more of a discussion about the findings so far. Yeah, down there.
I'd just like to emphasise that this is very much highlights. If I point out that that's the Service Design Discovery Report. These are the five separate technical design reports. We've summarised it into about 17 pages of highlights, and then we've summarised the highlights into this. So there will be lots of questions, but please, if you've got questions, the answers are probably in here, but if not, then we will quite happily take those on board. Okay. Second half of the discovery was all to do with technical discovery findings. What we asked them to do was various different things. Firstly, a technical options summary. So what models exist? So not looking at particular solutions, looking at the models, the types of solutions that there are, and whether they were the right fit for what we were looking to do. Then looking at a solution, what characteristics should it have? Again, at a fairly high level, what types of things do we want it to do, and what therefore does it need to look like to be able to achieve those? And then we asked them to put some thought into what an alpha might or should look like, give us an idea of cost, always useful, and then glossary. You'll find a program glossary in amongst all of the documents. There's an awful lot of chat around identity, and not always everybody is using the same terms in the same way. So what we started to do is to actually pin down what we mean by identity, what we mean by authentication, what we mean by verification, authentication and such like. And there's a lot in there to make sure that we are talking about the same thing. So, moving on, technical options summary. So, for example, I think I'll try not to stand in front of it very much. I'll go over here. There were broadly 6 models that were found and looked at. This model at the top there, some might have hubs, some might have directories, so they're in there as possibles, but broadly you get the kind of multiple identity providers being accessed via a hub, so that's the kind of gov.uk verify model. There are multiple identity providers without hubs, so that's generally what's done in mobile telephone connections. Single IDP with a hub, so New Zealand has gone for that route, pairing up with the post office there. And single IDP without a hub, I mean those are kind of Google, Facebook, Yahoo, those types of things. The others broadly fall into kind of personal data stores type ideas, and there's lots of examples. I've tried, wary of the fact that there are representatives from some of these organisations in the room, I've tried to be as generic and non-specific as possible. Others may exist, obviously. But they are much more of the active management by individuals of their personal data. What we then did was evaluated them against what we felt were the requirements. So some priority requirements, some additional, nice to haves. Evaluated the priority requirements at double the score. So not entirely scientific, but this was just really as an initial. This was done in the first week and a half, to try to pull out whether there were any obvious silver bullets. If there was a model out there that really did fit very well with what we were trying to do, so marked them up and came to the conclusion, no, not really. Nothing really fits exactly what we're looking for, so that's when we went back to basics, started looking at what should the characteristics of a solution be. So that's then where we move on. One size unlikely to fit all. Need an approach that allows multiple solutions. Could be a catalogue or portal approach. Should allow common integration and common UX. So try and hide some of the complexity. If we're going to make a complex system, let's try and hide as much of that complexity as we can from the end user. Existing Scottish identity assets not sufficient to provide for a solution, and we'll see why as I go through it in a bit more detail. Verify, UK Verify, should be part of the solution. Seems to fit fairly well, but some problems with the reach, and that's assuming, of course, that it's easy to simply plug into it. And it certainly would provide a common approach for the existing Verify users that are out there. And the personal data store, as you saw, it came up as a pretty high contender in the scoring. We need to factor that into any future solution as well. So let me just catch up a minute. So, solution characteristics. What we asked them to do, what we set out to do, was to map the expectations and requirements for a common approach against what there is out there in the marketplace. So, took into account user attitudes to what an OIA solution should look like. So all the stuff that you've just heard about our user research, factored that in. Why those choices might be significant, and the pros and cons. And this was to help distill the myriad of potential approaches and combinations of approaches to a manageable number that could be prioritised. So, for example, the types of questions around characteristics that we were asking. Should the user be able to choose between multiple solutions? Now that's important because there are a lot of competing requirements in here. There are different needs of wide demographic and geographic coverage of individuals. There are differing attitudes to privacy, as we've already heard, that have been expressed through user research, and whether there's a willingness there to trade privacy off against convenience. But there's also different requirements of relying parties. So we have the wide range of potential use cases, from my bin hasn't been collected and I want to phone up and tell you about that, right through to I have a complex health condition that I manage actively, and I have a wearable that needs to trade health data backwards and forwards on my behalf with the relevant authorities. So there's a wide variety in there, and it's very unlikely that any solution would fit exactly with all of those. Should the user be able to segregate different aspects of their life? In a word, here we go, here's a good word. Look up the glossary. Unlinkability. This was introduced into the report, and I looked at that, oh God, what does that mean? It means a feature of privacy-enhancing technologies and systems that prevent unauthorised linkability. So you don't have to look up linkability. Linkability means the ability for organisations to determine independently of the individual that two records or accounts correspond to the same individual. And that's important because it's at the heart of how appropriate it is to for different organisations to be able to link that data and come up with an aggregated view of a person without their know-how or say-so, without their permission. So a lot of this is really quite a cultural issue. So, for example, we look globally, Germany, Austria, New Zealand, those types of organisations that have put in place a digital identity solution are very, very hard on making sure that data is not able to be linked without that permission. Whereas the one that everyone holds up, Estonia, it's a very different cultural background. There's not a great deal of problem seen in that country about being able to link data, and it does make it far easier, but culturally it's something that's not really going to fit with the UK's history. Data choice. How much control should the user have over the sharing and use of their personal data? Well, this is the bit in commercials where it all gets a bit sciencey, and simple things like yogurt become complex compounds called bifidus digestivum. Data choice sounds simple. It's about an attribute. This is where we get into attributes. An attribute in identity terms is an item of verified personal information, for example, name, age, address, but could also include entitlements to drive or entitlement to receive a benefit. So this choice here is about whether attributes held by organisations could or should be made available to other organisations to make their access to services run more smoothly. And the example of this that came up during user research was really around benefit claimants. Having to deal with multiple organisations, especially UK, Scottish and local government. And there was a feel that the claimant was a pig in the middle, having to go to one organisation to get a piece of information purely to hand on to the next organisation. So that's why this data choice and the control over sharing of data becomes an important consideration in any potential solution. Sorry, I must remember to breathe. That, don't know what's happened to the slide. It wasn't like that this morning. What it actually says is sources choice. How much choice should be given to users about where identity attributes are sourced from? Now, that's important because the previous point of the data choice recommendations, the recommendations that come out of this are adopt an architecture that is attribute based to ensure that the system is as flexible in the future as it possibly can be. Where possible, provide the end user with personal data store or equivalent as the means to manage and control aspects of identity. And importantly, for this next one, do not replicate attribute data unnecessarily. Because as a system develops and more organisations are going through digital transformation and holding their data in a way that it may then become accessible to others, then it's likely that those attributes or verified pieces of identity related data may exist in more than one place. So this question is around what control should there be over where you get that data? And there may well be difficulties in proving identity using traditional sources of data, so should we be able to go to innovative new sources of data, whether that's going through social network type things or whether that's going to microsources of data. One of the projects that's on the go at the moment in London is particularly looking at microsources of data around housing data. There may be other types of, other sorts of data for people who in general don't have a good or don't have any credit history. So the ability to go to organisations like Experian to show that that person is who they say they are massively diminished, and we need to find other ways. And it's the new sources of data that may provide that ability. One left, attribute, storage, location, choice. There we go, right. Taken to its ultimate conclusion then, should users have choice and control over where those bits of data are held? And ultimately, do they want it? Or is that just too complex for the majority of users? The more choice that is brought into a system, the more niche it becomes and the more difficult it becomes for the average user to take that leap of faith to create the digital identity and see what the benefit is for them to do that. But the recommendation that comes out of this is that personal data stores should be optional but desirable requirement on any identity provider that is taking part in this. So, summary, conclusions. There are lots of competing requirements here, as I said at the start. Wide demographics, old, young, not so good at technical things, not got access to good broadband, not got access to any broadband, not got access to a home. So there's a wide variety of people that we would need to cater for. And geographic coverage, I mean, part of what I just talked about is caused by the geography of where they're living, but it may well be that it's much more difficult to access particular places to prove your identity face to face, if you're in a particularly remote geographic location, for example. Differing attitudes to privacy, talked about that a lot, and the differing requirements of relying parties, so that different level of assurance that's required for different types of services. What we then did was spend a little bit of time just looking at what exists in Scotland, UK at the moment, so existing digital identity services, to see what they would be able to bring to the party, if you like. So the services that we looked at were Verify, gov.uk Verify. There's much talk at the moment about the individual identity providers as part of gov.uk Verify being released from the tie to, from the gov.uk Verify hub to be able to offer their services independently, so we looked at that as well. There's a lot of new fintech providers that are working in this space, particularly around doing the know your customer or anti-money laundering in the financial services. So would they be able to provide something? And the My Account, which is available to local authorities, health organisations in Scotland, but due to the issue, that small issue that happened 4 years ago, not available any more widely. March those against the types of recommendations that just come out of that solution characteristics, and you'll see there that Verify comes out pretty well, but not so great around some of the more difficult to reach areas. Identity providers on their own, much the same as you would expect, because in general they're using the same background data. It's the credit data that they're using in the background to verify people who are who they say they are. Fintech comes out okay across the board, but the real problem there is the lack of scale and the lack of maturity that those providers have. And My Account, mixed, it's fair to say. Now, a lot of that is down to the fact that it was really set up to do something different. It wasn't set up to be providing a digital identity for everyone to access multiple services. It was set up as an easy way to get people in the door to local authorities, and then local authorities would work with those individuals to bring their level of assurance up. Some have done that, some haven't. So there are issues around whether that would be a possible model for us moving forward. Yes, I've just said that, I think. Jumping ahead, there we are. Separate from the actual solutions, we looked at, are there any quick wins out there? Are there existing pools of identities, digital identities, that we could plug into services easily? And the answer is not really. Verify has not taken off in the way that it was supposed to. We think there are around 200,000 people I get picked up when I say there are 220,000 people. There are 220,000 accounts with Verify. They may well be multiple accounts for individuals. So there are 220,000 accounts in Scotland, we think, that have been through Verify. So why would we not allow them to access Scottish Public Services using that route? It's an easy, quick win. But the situation is evolving. There will be movement in this space in the financial services sector in the next little while. They have directives that they have to be working towards, which is Payment Services Directive 2 and Open Banking. So there is movement in this space. So what we're trying to say is be flexible. Build an architecture that's flexible, because there will be stuff that will come along that may be better than what we have at the moment. So what next? Very, very briefly. This is where it all gets a bit technical. That's the proposed solutions architecture, where we have multiple relying parties, perhaps some of them providing data sources. So perhaps you might be able to go to one that has established that somebody is over 18 and say, is John Smith over 18? And then say, yes, he is, because we have seen that proof. You then have a hub bit in the middle, which provides that unlinkability. So it's not possible to build up an aggregated view of a person and what they are accessing and put those things together to derive other information, unless that is what the individual wants. And then multiple identity providers at the bottom, with this other sources at the bottom right, to deal with those who really do struggle to make it through the Verify process because of the issues around residency or credit checks. So the alpha looks a bit like that. It's just basically a simplified version turned on its side. And we're having discussions at the moment with various organisations, some of whom are in the room, about whether we can build this over the next couple of months and then kick off an alpha in September, to run from September to Mark H, apparently. Yes. So that would be a 6-month alpha, 8 3-week sprints. much of it around the kind of technical aspects, the interoperability, so looking at how different systems would interact, and a much bigger emphasis on making sure that we are having users at the centre of it and testing it and making sure that they are happy with how things work and look. So, what will the alpha look like? As I say, these are discussions that are ongoing at the moment. So if anybody wants to say no, we haven't signed up yet, that's okay. This is as proposed by the plan for alpha. So what you see up there is Social Security Agency of Scotland, e-health and local authorities. And so as I say, we've had discussions over the last 2 weeks with all of those to be the initial relying parties to plug in. We have a proposal in at the moment to get funding to set up a larger online identity assurance team, bringing in a business analyst, technical architect, service design lead, and other contract resources to do the management of the integration piece. And then there's a big box over there with lots of identity providers like the post office and hub providers and various other bits and pieces. We have approached Open Identity Exchange for that. Again, in discussions with them at the moment about how we set that up, how we manage that. But they already operate in this space. They have managed multiple projects for the Cabinet Office, GDS, over the last 5 years. They have a model in place that works. So we are looking to work with them to build the alpha and learn what we can from that prototype between September and March. Oh, and there's another. And that is it. That's the whistle stop tour. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of what we've been doing for the last 6 months. I'm open to questions while I take a breath. Yes?
I'm just wondering how much overlap there is between this conversation and the Scottish Government's e-voting conversations, where there's been lots of talk about blockchain providing our identity. I'm pleased to see there is some overlap between the conversation. So that this isn't siloed off into one thing and the floating it into another. Also on the hypothetical user journey, this starts with someone needing to establish identity, so something that happens in adulthood. But I would ask, what about identity prior to adulthood, such as access to school records, access to your children's health or your own health as you grow into maturity, and other things like that. Yeah, I think the user journey needs to start sooner.
I'll take first one first. E-voting, yes. Liz, who's running that project, was one of the first people we spoke to. Okay. There was a workshop last week that Gavin went to on behalf of the Online Identity Assurance team. So we are staying very closely in touch with them. There is a huge crossover, absolutely. What they've tried to do is there's an awful lot of stuff that is in addition to identity that e-voting needs to look at around the actual process and the machines and everything else. But we are absolutely speaking to each other about this, and it should not be, nobody in Scottish public sector should be going off doing their own thing on this, because this is hopefully the common approach. On young people, yes, around the diagram that was, alternative data sources. There is very much this national entitlement card and the process that people go through to get a national entitlement card, whether we can use that face-to-face piece to have two potential uses. One to get your national entitlement card, but also to give that level of assurance to a potential online identity. There's Young Scot card, which my son came home with yesterday, in fact. Very, very pleased. He's in his first day at Blairna High School today. So we know that there are processes that go on in Scotland at the moment that may be able to feed into this as alternative data sources. And yes, they start at about age 12 for starting high school. But we need to be very careful around that, because that then triggers all sorts of issues around who has access to what data, and parents become, I know, very worried about data and it being held. And one of the things that was talked about being brought in is using biometric data in schools and attaching that to young Scott card as a way of making it easy to access libraries and things like that. So there's a lot of emotive stuff in there around young people, so we don't want to be entirely derailed by a lot of that as well.
To add to what Mike was saying, that we don't have a boundary currently within the programme that says this is just for adults to prove their identity. So we have been exploring issues around young people and their access to online services. So that's likely to continue in some way in the coming work, but we will start narrowing at some point into very specific services, but we're actively exploring issues for young people at the moment.
And it's clear that one of the most beneficial use cases that you can come up with is the ability to prove that you're old enough to access something. So we're trying to build an obvious benefit into this for individuals. Then that's a major one. Any other questions?